Gary DePaul with Unlabel Leadership. Welcome to episode 59, Will Thalheimer Models Learning Intelligence. Here's a shout out to listeners in North Carolina, in particular, Mount Holly, Charlotte, Lenoir, Mooresville, Greensboro, Concord, I almost said Concord, Waxhaw, Statesville, Winston-Salem, Denver, and I'll leave the other 21 cities for a different episode. With that, let's get started. When I think of Will, I think of someone who has deep expertise in learning and development and human performance improvement. He is the co-founder of the Learning Development Accelerator, which is a global community for learning and development professionals. And he is the co-host of Truth in Learning, which is a podcast that I was a guest on. Will is also a principal at Tier 1 Performance Solutions, which specializes in learning to performance and helping companies with that strategy. That fits Will perfectly. That's because Will is the author of the Learning Transfer Evaluation Model, or LTEM for short. He has extensively researched the learning transfer topic and probably could cite sources from the top of his head. He also authored a book called Performance Focused Smiley Sheets. If anyone's involved in training, you know what a smiley sheet is. Will is modest and he is a good person to know. Part 1, The Need for Feedback. If you've listened to previous podcasts, you know I talk about 7 leadership principles, and I talk about these extensively or write about them extensively in my books. The 7th one is develop leadership practices continuously. If you read as much about leadership as I do, you'll know that there's a strong linkage, positive correlation between learning and leadership. You can't be effective at leadership if you're not continuously improving how you lead. As situations change, as environments change, as you age, you need to continuously strengthen your leadership. A large part of that learning comes from feedback, which is a critical part to learning in general. In this story, Will talks about feedback and some other things. I'll let Will explain.
This was a long time ago, and I was a relatively younger man.
5 years ago?
Yeah, right. Thank you. And so I worked for a company called the Strategic Management Group. I just graduated with my PhD in human learning and cognition. Came back and they wanted me to run the leadership development product line, and I did that. But then they said, in order for you to run this, you really need to go out and do this as well. You need to be a leadership trainer. I said, well, I don't know much about leadership. Well, you've been a project manager, Will, and you've got a PhD. Yeah, but my PhD is not in leadership. It's in learning. You'll be fine. They'll love you.
Project manager, PhD, it all equals leadership. So right. Yeah, you're set.
So I was fairly mediocre at it. I do remember it fondly. And the way we did it was probably a little bit different. We would go out and we would do typical training stuff in the morning. And then in the afternoon, we would put people into a simulation. They'd work in a team. And as a team, they would play one leader walking, managing this organization or managing their situation. And they would make decisions in the simulation, and that would affect their income statement and balance sheet. We usually ran 90-minute, 2-hour simulations. And then we'd have a break. They would get feedback from the simulation. And in those days, we printed it out, or I guess they could read it on the screen a little bit. They'd have time for that. And then they would sort of decide what it meant. And then we get back together in the big group and we'd discuss it. That was fun. And so that was sort of our methodology. The one thing I remember that I did that was good.
One thing.
Well,
besides giving feedback.
Well, there was some things that we did really well, like simulations.
Yeah.
Those were good. And we know that when the learning research tells us that if you give people realistic practice, that they're more likely to remember. Having different perspectives of people as they discuss it to make a decision was good. So one thing that was really bad was that, I would go out and teach And eventually I might get applause at the end, but then I would never see those people again. Terrible learning design, because I don't know what obstacles they face. I don't know whether they tried things out or not. There was no follow-up, just a bad learning design. But one part of my little routine as a leadership trainer that I like was I let them know that leaders are in the dark. Who sees how good a leader you are? Your boss does not see how good a leader you are because they're not there in the room with you in those one-to-one conversations when you're running staff meetings, etc. Your peers, they don't see what you're doing either. So the only people that see how well you're doing are your direct reports. But because you're the boss, they're a little bit afraid to tell you they really think.
Yeah.
You're not getting feedback. And we know to improve in anything, you need to get feedback. There you are. As a manager, you are in the dark. You've got a problem. And so the thing that I would do is I would do this little spiel, and then I would get down on my knees and say, listen, what you got to do, you got to beg for feedback. And then you have to listen to it and not be defensive. And then you've got to do some things to show them that you're actually activated to make improvements. And that was fun. That was my one good bit.
Yeah, and it's a good bit because you got to beg for the feedback. You're giving permission to those who report to you to openly and honestly say what they think to a certain extent. And the crucial moment is, what do you do with that feedback? And what do you say to the person once they give you the feedback? Your point is you have to listen and you have to try to make changes. If you don't, then they're not going to give you any more feedback.
Exactly. And you also have to realize that for you to gain their trust, the trust to give real feedback, it might take time. Might not happen all at once, particularly if you've been the kind of manager that's kind of a jerk, or, the kind of person that doesn't like feedback, or, punishes people or whatever. If you're not, a sensitive, authentic manager, then your people are going to be less likely to give you that feedback. You're going to be less likely to get better over time. We improve by hearing something, saying, oh, maybe I could improve in that, trying things out. And you sort of have this, hopefully, to get better as a job as a leader over time, you build on what you've got before. So you fix some of the bigger problems in the beginning, and then you keep cycling through. And we never reach perfection. There's always something we need to get better at. So
I remember a TED Talk long time ago where this one, I'll use the term boss, decided to go through this process of sort of like 360 blind feedback that was facilitated by the TED Talk person talking. And she gave this guy feedback that he was abrasive to his employees when they tried to give him feedback. And he's like, what? I can't believe that. Why would they say that? I don't understand that. That doesn't make any sense to me. But, just a case in point. And
exactly a case in point. Hey, buddy, are you looking in the mirror?
Yeah, exactly. But he caught on and he tried. And as soon as he showed that he was listening, it got to the point where when he would meet with his team and he started to get abrasive, they would say, boss, you're doing that thing again. And then he would stop, look at them, and then they'd all start laughing, and it's like you said, it takes time to build that trust, and you can't build that trust without having an environment where you're open to feedback.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in fact, that reminds me of I got feedback as a leadership trainer. When I was pretty new at it, I got a lot of bad smile sheet results, people. This one guy who's my client contact, this was a large organization, had like 800,000 employees. None of that's relevant. But right before I was going on in the morning, he called me into this walk-in closet. And my first thought is, okay, he's hitting on me. That's that's the opinion I had of myself back then. What is he doing? Why is he pulling? He goes, Will, I want to emphasize something for you, that when you talk, you need to modulate your voice. Sometimes you want to talk faster. Sometimes you want to talk slower. Sometimes you want to talk with a low register, sometimes with a higher register. By modulating your voice, Will, you will keep people's attention much better. And, there was no introduction. Will, I want to give you some feedback. He just pulled me in and he starts talking. I go, oh, I get it. And so I then start my workshop, and I tried to pay attention to that. And it was a really good advice. So there was feedback and it worked.
Part 2, check my thinking. Many organizations work diligently to improve their culture, and a popular concept that's being circulated is the idea of having employees think of themselves as entrepreneurs. In other words, they want employees to critically think about their decisions and their actions as if they own the company, and they're the ones who have invested their time and effort into making this company what it is today. There are variations of that entrepreneurial theme, and Will has a story which kind of reminds me of that type of thinking. Here's Will.
You and I were talking earlier.
Yeah.
And I had mentioned that I joined a new company, Tier 1 Performance. We are a full-service performance improvement company. I joined them about 4 months ago. Well, a couple things interesting. Number one, I had not had a boss. I never worked for anybody for 22 years. I had my own consulting practice. So I get there and they tell me, well, we don't really have bosses. Now, we do have a CEO, and we have people who have senior roles, but you're not going to have like a supervisor. Oh. And so during the onboarding process, they explained to me that we have this thing called DDA, Distributed Decision-Making Authority. And the way that plays out is that every person is sort of encouraged and required to take their own initiative, make their own decisions. Now, sometimes you're in a group, and then you have to decide, well, let's try to work it out. But if we have to make a decision, if we have to move forward, who then decides? And the answer to that question is the person who is closest to the decision. Now, that means different things at different times. Oftentimes, if you're working with clients, it's the person who's been the engagement manager who knows the client best, and they will make the decision. I'll give you an example. So we were working on a project, and as part of this project, it looked like what would be helpful is to sort of have a model of what we were doing. And this model is related to performance improvement. And so I thought, oh, that's cool. I started crafting a model because this is something I'd actually been working on before I came to Tier 1. And I started crafting this model, sharing it with my team, and they're giving feedback and we're making it better. Who's going to make the decision about the final version of this model? Because I'm the one closest to that decision. I am the one with sort of the veto power. When you have this kind of system, there has to be some things that go into making it work. And one is to have good teammates who are open. Everybody has to be reasonable with each other. There has to be trust. Tier 1 is set up really nicely in this way. We have a very strong culture. It's sort of values-driven, mission-driven. Our mission is, I won't get the words exactly right, but we help people do their best work. And we think by doing that we help make the world a better place. We help organizations activate their business, their operations, their learning strategies. But it's mission driven. It's a B Corp. So that sort of has some social responsibility aspects to it. It's employee owned. So all the employees are encouraged to think of themselves as business owners. When you have this distributed decision-making authority, you're not just thinking personally for yourself. You have to think about, well, would this be a good investment for the organization? A good investment in time, a good investment in money, et cetera.
Sounds like a natural transition from being an entrepreneur to working in this company and having that mindset of deciding what's best for the company as you do things.
That is so right, because I have worked for myself for so long. I thought, I want a job. I want a regular paycheck. I'm done with this yo-yo thing that happens when you're a consultant. But I wonder what it's going to be like working for a boss and just having to toe the party line. And for me, I feel lucky to find a place like Tier 1 that, has a more organic, natural, sort of decision-making, leadership kind of apparatus.
Yeah, and it sounds also like with your teammates, you're not accountable to a boss. You're accountable for each other and yourself.
And the client.
And the client.
We talk a lot about having, listening to the voice of the client. As an organization, we are there to help them help their learners, help their workers. And we don't just deal with learning stuff, by the way, we deal with all kind of performance improvement issues. But that's our role. That's what we think we're there to do. Having that focus also helps in this regard too, because when you are the person closest to the decision, you are thinking about what the values are, what your goals are, how we're going to meet the needs of the customer. All that goes into supporting that person's decision making. And also, we also have this saying, or this sort of memorable phrase that we use a lot, and it's check our thinking. You have this authority to make the decision yourself, but you also know that probably you don't have all the answers. If I hear this phrase almost every day. I got to check my thinking on that. Or listen, hey, you guys, I'm Will Thalheimer. I've sort of had some expertise in learning and learning evaluation, but still, I might have some blind spots about this. I'd like to check my thinking, and that helps enable this kind of system as well. And of course, the foundation of that has to be some trust, right?
Yeah, I like that phrase, and it really. I don't know what I was going to say. Hey, I like that. I like that phrase.
Well, I mean, we have about 300 people working for the company, and this culture, bubbled up over many years before I was there. Took some special leadership to want to do that because, naturally you create a company, and I think there were 3 original partners in this thing. So you might think, well, I've created this company, I've done the sweat equity, I've taken the risks. So I should make the decisions. But these folks, they were sort of, maybe the word's enlightened, but they were willing to, make the company employee owned, first of all, give some of the authority away, which to me it's remarkable.
It's definitely a way of empowering other people.
Yeah, I think you get the best out of people when you enable that kind of sort of collegial attitude about things.
Part 3, Models Enable Breakthroughs. If you work in any organization, at some point you're going to run into models. I even have one. I have a few models that I built over the years. Specific to leadership, I have a leadership development model that I talk about in one of my books. Like me, Will has made several models as well. And in this conversation, we talk about one in particular, LTEM, which has to do with learning evaluation. Near the end of this conversation, we talk about what leadership has to do with models, or what models have to do with leadership. Will starts us off by explaining LTEM.
Of course, your audience might not know what this is or why it is. Some people are probably not even in the learning field. They're executives or leaders of their own listening to you. Let me explain it a little if I can, and you can fill in the blanks. I'll let you check my thinking on this if I miss anything.
That sounds good.
In the learning and development field, we like to occasionally evaluate our learning programs, things we develop. For many, many years, there was one dominant model, most popularly known as the Kirkpatrick 4-level model. I've been calling it the Kirkpatrick-Catzell model because it turns out Raymond Catzell was actually the originator of the 4-level idea. So there's been this dominant model. Well, it has been good in some ways, but not really sufficient in other ways. I've been in the field a long time. I heard practitioners complain about it for years. Researchers have said things that weren't that complimentary about it. I said, well, hey, maybe we can make a new evaluation model and it'll be better. And so I started out and went through a bunch of iterations. I asked a lot of smart people for their feedback. And, I had gotten up to, instead of 4 levels, I'd gotten up to like 15 levels. And people told me, Will, it's too much. So anyway, it ended up, it's sort of in a stable state now. It has 8 tiers in it, from tier 1 to tier 8. I think probably I'll just go through those quickly and not go into too much depth about them. But tier 1 measures attendance. Tier 2 measures learner participation, interest, that kind of thing. Tier 3 is the learner's perspectives. Oftentimes we gather those through what are called smile sheets or learner surveys. Tier 4 is measurement of people's knowledge after the learning event. Tier 5 is their decision-making ability, their decision-making competence. Tier 6 is their full task competence. So not only are they able to make a decision, but they're able to actually carry things out. Tier 7, and this is the first evaluation level that is at performance on the job. This is Tier 7 is transfer. Did you actually transfer this thing that you learned and put it into practice in your work? And then Tier 8 is the effects of transfer. So did you get the business impact? Were the learners who went through this, were they positively impacted? Were coworkers positively impacted? And you can go broader than that to the community, society, the environments, et cetera. LTEM, as I call it, the Learning Transfer Evaluation Model, is a way to think about evaluation. But there's a couple interesting things about this that relate to leadership a little bit, and I'll get to that in a minute. But let me just say that the real benefit of LTEM is it has learning intelligence baked into it. So learning isn't in one bucket, but learning is divided into knowledge, decision-making competence, and task competence. Let me stop there and see if you have any questions, you want to clarify anything, and then I could continue.
The larger part of that model is about learning, as you described it. Was it tiers 1 through 6?
Yeah.
And then you get into the top two, which is really getting into the meat of it, which is showing that there has been some learning transfer to actually performing and doing the work. And then the top tier, of course, showing that there was some benefit to applying the learning to the work that was being done, or the work that's going on.
Yeah. The only thing I'm going to correct you on is the top two tiers are certainly important. But, if we're in the learning profession, if we're not tracking our success, creating knowledge, creating decision-making competence, creating task competence, then we're not getting good enough feedback at the kind of granularity that we need to make the kind of decisions that we have to make about our learning designs or the way that we deploy it. There's many benefits to the model, but that's the one that really stands out for me.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
So here's the funny thing. I developed this as a learning evaluation model, and people started using it that way. But then what happened is they begin to use it for learning design. They begin to say, okay, well, if these are sort of our long-term goals, and we're going to create a learning program and we want some outcomes, yeah, we do want people to have more knowledge, but really we hope they can make decisions and actually complete tasks. And then they start thinking about, whoa, wow, maybe we should design our learning to have a little bit more realistic decision-making practice. And where we can, maybe we ought to give them real practice. Like, let's say we're teaching people presentation skills. Let's not just teach them some concepts. Let's actually have them practice those skills and get feedback on that. And we can evaluate that. It was originally designed as an evaluation model, but now people use it sort of as a project management model, or not project management so much, but as you're doing your design and development, to think about some of the goals you might have.
Yeah, exactly. Think about the end in mind. So once someone completes a course or an experience that you've designed, like you said, a presentation program, or it's something related to leadership. If you think about what you need learners to do differently or where the real gaps are, it kind of becomes your guide and your guiding principles for what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you a story. So a woman by the name of El-Hammurabi, doctoral student. She's not a doctoral student anymore. Now she's a doctor, but she was a doctoral student at the UNLV, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She had this hypothesis that if she introduced LTEM to a learning team, that they would develop better learning evaluations, but they would also be inspired to create better learning designs. And she introduced this to a nurse training team at a hospital. And that's exactly what she found. When they started looking at LTEM, their team just said, whoa, we can do better. They've been stuck in the same rut for many, many years, doing the same old way. But this sort of unlocked them. To relate this back to the meta topic here of leadership, in some ways, that's what leaders do, right? They unlock the traditional things that we're stuck in and help move us forward to the next level, the next innovation.
And that's why introducing a model like this is so powerful. If you're in leadership, you want to challenge the people you work with. Think about your company you're working with now. It's not necessarily the people that report to you, it's the people you work with. And I think that was a good example at the beginning of when you started talking about the company, about how you created a model or were working on a model, circulated it among the different people because you found that there was a gap in thinking about what you're trying to do for a particular client. It opened up some opportunities for you and your colleagues.
Yeah, well, it wasn't me that discovered the gap. We did that together. But that's the way models work. Tier 1 has these amazing models, performance experience map, performance factors. We have pet names for them. But these were developed in certain situations that you needed to have a breakthrough, a way of looking at things, a way of thinking about things. And I think that's one lesson for leaders, is that one of the ways to change the frame is to figure out what situation you're in and what needs unlocking, right? But then figure out what model and the way to facilitate that model, right? Because it just can't be a static thing. It has to be a process of discovery and invention. Figure what that might be. And you might have to try a bunch of different things, but models or guidelines or structures can really help us lead in some sense.
And expose some of the blind spots that we have. I'm thinking of LTEM. I may not be thinking ahead of transfer and focusing, if I was very traditional, on developing content, which is what happens a lot in leadership training. By having that model introduced to me, and I love the example you gave with the nursing group, that it gives you a broader perspective of what you're trying to do. Thinking about it now, it gives you some additional purpose. It's not just about delivering content, it's delivering an experience that will help the recipients to benefit and make better contributions to the organizations and grow as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the models, and maybe it's not really even a model, but it's a visual. One of the things that I share that seems to unlock people in the way they think about learning, I share the learning and forgetting curves.
Yeah.
And I've shown this 1,000 times to L&D people, but I've also shared it with business leaders. I remember one meeting, one of the leaders was like almost got up out of his chair and said, "That's it. That's what we need." And I was talking about, okay, people learn, but people forget. So if we know that people forget, we have to think about, well, how can we minimize forgetting? And then I talk about 3 methods for minimizing forgetting. But the fact that you got this model in front of you that just makes the point really clearly, it just picture paints 1,000 words kind of thing, but it just gets people energized to think differently. I do want to leave one, models can be double-edged swords. In the learning field, we use a model called ADDIE, ADDIE, and it stands for Analysis, Design, Development, Implementation, and Evaluation. Now, it's got some good messages that it sends. When I mean messages, I'm sort of talking about like in the behavioral economic nudging idea a little bit. So it pushes us to think in a certain way. So ADDIE pushes us to think we should do some serious analysis in the beginning. And we should do some serious evaluation at the end. Now, the serious analysis in the beginning, that's a good message. Do serious evaluation, that's a good message. Now, to put serious evaluation at the end, that's not a great message, because we really should be evaluating throughout. We know we should be rapid prototyping, getting feedback, improving during the design phase, during the development phase, et cetera. So all models send good messages and bad messages. So you have to be careful when you select your model that it is pushing good messages. That's one of the reasons why the 4-level model had some problems, because it just pushed a message that all learning was the same. You put it in one bucket. And so people would say, okay, we need to evaluate learning. Oh, okay, well, let's just do a knowledge check. Well, that whole push, that pushed us all to doing sort of low-level learning because we were aiming for knowledge, when we want to aim for performance. We want to aim for decision-making ability and task competence. So models can be a double-edged sword. So you have to pick your models carefully.
My thanks to Will Thalheimer. If you'd like to learn more about Will, go to the show notes. And if you have a comment or question, go to unlabelleadership.com. Click the message icon and you can leave a voicemail message up to 1 minute. I'd like to thank those who contribute to the show. Your contributions help pay for the production costs, which makes a difference because this is a volunteer show. And I'd like to thank you for listening. Until next time, lead on.